Hi there, and welcome to another BigLipz podcast. My name is Sam Macaulay Blair, and as ever, I'm joined by the wonderful Kathryn Maurice. In case this is your first time joining, which if so, what an episode to choose, because this is basically the only time we've ever done a two-part episode. um, so welcome. I hope this makes sense. Basically, the two of us are two independent filmmakers who have decided to start up our own YouTube channel and podcast series. This is our second series where we discuss all things TV. We had a first series where we discussed movies. But that's well behind us now. As I mentioned, we're 16 episodes into season 2. And last episode, we basically discussed, or started to discuss, cliffhangers, which is something that we pretty much think is more or less exclusive to TV series. You do find them in movies and other mediums, but I think it's fair to say that the cliffhanger is pretty much synonymous with television. So last episode we discussed to great length cliffhangers, and also discussed half of the show, the new TV series Inside Man, which stars David Tennant and Dolly Wells and Stanley Tucci. So warning, there will be full spoilers for that show, along with a number of other series, which will be listed in the description. So should you want to avoid them, feel free to just take a glance at that. But yeah, last time we had only seen the first two episodes had only aired of the show, and as a result, we basically commented on the cliffhanger and speculated as to where we thought the series was going to go. So we will come back to that further in this podcast. But since we spent so long talking about cliffhangers last time, I thought this time we'd slightly shift the conversation to the part that we never really discussed that much last time, which is the conclusion. Obviously an episode will end with a cliffhanger, and then it's sort of the job of the next episode to resolve it. So, Kathryn, the first question for you is, what makes for a satisfying payoff in your eyes? What makes for a good resolution to a cliffhanger?
I think one of the first things, and we'll kind of discuss this a wee bit later as well, I feel like it definitely needs to be, in the continuing episode, there needs to be some kind of callback to the cliffhanger. I feel like that's just a given, especially the way that you used to watch TV where it was a weekly, or sometimes you get a cliffhanger at the end of a season and then you have to wait a year or 2 years or whatever it is until you get the payoff for the cliffhanger. So I think I always like a way that kind of it's almost like a recap, but not quite as obvious as a previously on Lost type thing. I feel like as well, we were talking last week about how a good cliffhanger tends to maybe come out of nowhere, or it's quite shocking or quite quite clever. We were talking about Sherlock obviously last week, so I feel like for it to make sense, you kind of need to go back to what happened and then kind of work back from there almost. Especially and a good example is the Sherlock one, because it's so clever. So you need the cliffhanger needs to kind of be explained to you. I feel like as well. I think I much prefer a kind of payoff like that that makes sense, but it's still maybe not as guessable. Do you know what I mean? I feel like my least favorite type is when it's like an absolute just ex machina, like something comes out of nowhere and saves the day, and it doesn't make sense. It feels really, really lazy. And I feel like especially if you've set it up properly and it's a good cliffhanger and people are talking about it, and then you go back to it and nothing's happened, or it turns out that person's not actually dead, or if you talk, I can't ever remember the show. I mean, it's happened in a lot of shows. I think West Wing did one where someone gets shot. And then a really easy way to do that would be to be, oh, actually it wasn't the main character you thought it was. The bullet actually ricocheted and hit the wall. Do you know what I mean? I feel like basically I feel like the cliffhanger should change something within the show, similar to when we spoke before about sequels and second seasons, where I feel like it should be a continuation of something, but have a kind of to stand on its own merit. Why would you bother putting a cliffhanger in if nothing changed? And do you know what I mean? It just means that the stakes aren't very high. if there's going to be another cliffhanger, you're just going to be like, oh well, that's like, if you think of, it's a movie example, but if you think of Halloween, when it went through the phase, it went through so many iterations where Michael died and kept coming back to life that people knew he was going to come back to life. So when he died, it wasn't even fun anymore. So I feel like that's what you want to avoid with I know I've rambled on for so long about what not to do for a satisfying ending. But yeah, basically for me the main thing is that I feel like it needs to change part of the story or the plot or a particular character or something like that. There needs to be, like, the stakes need to have been paid off. And the other thing that I really, for me, it needs to make sense. Like, fair enough if it takes a wee bit of figuring out, like, oh yeah, like you need to think about it to put two and two together, but there's nothing worse than like a lazy cliffhanger where it doesn't make sense, or like I was saying, something just comes out of nowhere and saves the day. For me anyway, I feel like that's really annoying. I don't know whether it's just, it feels like laziness, do you know what I mean, on the part of the writer. And it just, like I was saying, it just doesn't make it as enjoyable, because the next time it happens you're like, oh well, they've got away with this before, so the stakes are immediately like absolutely rock bottom. So yeah, that was my scathing review. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with a lot of what you said, basically. I think you hit the nail on the head. Yeah, pretty fairly there. I think when it comes to resolving a cliffhanger, you really want it to be, there should be like, part of the fun of a cliffhanger is the sort of like theorizing, the speculation as to like, how it's going to be resolved. And I think you want it to be something, you want the resolution to be something clever, you want it to be a surprise. You don't want it to be like the first thing that you can think of. You always want to have missed something that in hindsight seems really obvious. I think that's kind of the joy in them. You don't want to outsmart the cliffhanger. And yeah, I think the best kind of cliffhangers and the best sort of payoffs for them kind of like, they almost act as like a premise for like the episode or the story that's to follow. They should effectively be a springboard for like what's to come. Because I think that means that you've got a good cliffhanger. You've basically turned the story in a new direction, and then you develop that new direction rather than just, there's nothing worse than like when like a cliffhanger happens and it turns the story one way and then like the resolution just turns it back the exact same way. It's sort of like you said. It feels cheap. You're just basically wasting time, and it stops you from caring about the next cliffhanger, like you say, because you don't have any faith in like the writers of the show to deliver, and you almost feel like foolish for like having got invested and having cared. So yeah, I think
I feel like it can feel quite gimmicky, like when it does that, like you're saying, that's such a good point. Like it springboards one way and then immediately goes back, and it's not even like it's I hate to say the phrase, but it's not like it's a new normal. It's just exactly the same normal that we had before. Do you know what I mean?
No, exactly. Like it just feels like it feels very. I think it calls attention to like the artifice of what you're watching. It makes you very aware that you're watching like a TV show that is like constructed as a TV show, because you're aware that they've done it because they needed to have a cliffhanger and because they wanted people back, rather than doing it because like the story demanded it. That's, I guess, when you're watching a TV show, you should always watch something that feels like it should be a TV show. And I guess we've talked probably a bit about this already in terms of like when we've discussed like adaptations, because we've had many episodes on adaptations. So I'm not gonna like reignite that debate, but I suppose that's maybe where you'll have shows that do this a little bit weaker, because and again, other mediums do have cliffhangers, but they maybe aren't as well built into the story as if you were like developing an original TV series, where like they're going to sort of build in cliffhangers. The episodes are deliberately constructed around the fact that they're going to end on a cliffhanger, rather than them telling a story, having broken it up into these chunks, and then being like, oh well, we kind of need like a cliffhanger in here, so I guess we better like pull something out of our ass. But yeah, no, I think I think like those are kind of the main. I mean, again, I really just reiterated the same points you made.
No, that's fair. I feel like you made such a good point where, like, the fact that a good cliffhanger has left you clues, potentially even like throughout the series. I think that's it's always really fun to watch that, because then I certainly get carried away, like, oh my god, and that's why they did that, and then you like and can almost explain everything in the series. I feel like that's like the mark of a really good cliffhanger, and
Absolutely.
good writers as well.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So out of curiosity, obviously you mentioned Sherlock before. Are there any like what are some of your examples of like your favorite sort of like payoffs to cliffhangers?
So one, this is going to be spoiler central, but one that I want to talk about was The Good Place. Have you seen The Good Place?
I have seen the first season and most of the second season, so I've not seen all of The Good Place.
Okay, I also haven't seen all of The Good Place, but I've seen up until the twist.
As in like season one.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Go.
So essentially, basically, the premise of the show is that the main character Eleanor dies in a freak accident, and she goes to the good place, which is essentially just kind of like heaven, basically.
Yeah. Such a good premise for a show.
It's so funny.
Yeah.
So yeah, so she ends up in the good place, and then the audience finds out very quickly that she does not belong there. She's been, by all accounts, a horrible human being, like nasty to everyone she meets. So she does not deserve there. We, the audience, know that she doesn't deserve to be there, and there's this kind of struggle as well, because you know that Eleanor's getting shown these memories of things that she's done. So you know that the poor person who's been mixed up with Eleanor is in the bad place, which is essentially like an iteration of hell. And of course, the cliffhanger is, I think it's the end of season one. When Eleanor figures out that they're not, in fact, in the good place, that they are and always have been in the bad place. And it's all just like a horrible, cruel punishment, basically, as part of their punishment for being bad, that they're because there's the kind of four main characters, and they're all being punished in different ways. Like Eleanor, who's super selfish and likes nice things, lives in this weird, horrible house with creepy clown paintings and different things like that. I think it's so funny, and that's exactly what you were talking about, where this is one of the ones where it completely changes the course of the show, because and it does it in such a good way. And like we were talking about, there are kind of hints throughout, because you're like, why? I can't even think. It was so long ago that I watched it, but there are definitely hints throughout where you're like, but it doesn't make sense why she would be there. Or there's things like
well, like you mentioned with the clown thing, I think is maybe one of the most obvious. Like it's done so cleverly because of the fact, I think, that it's a comedy. And so it sort of throws all these like unbelievable things at you because it's a comedy, and because of like just the sort of nature of the show, you just kind of accept it, because like comedies are, it's one of the things that you see in comedies where like main characters are just kind of punished. Your characters will be selfish and they'll kind of like suffer for the fact, and that's where a lot of the humor comes from, and that's where like that's what the show relies on, and things like it's just this crazy coincidence that the person that you're impersonating. They absolutely loved clowns, and you hate clowns, and so there's pictures of clowns everywhere, and the show makes like jokes about that. If it was like a drama, you'd maybe pay more attention to that and think, well, that's a bit weird, but because it's a comedy, you're just like, oh yeah, like it's just that's just like a really unfortunate coincidence, and they're making a joke out of that. And there's loads of little things like that, I think, that like you don't really think too hard on them. And then, when the twist is revealed, you do have that moment of like, of course, there's all these little things that don't actually make any sense, like you say.
Yeah, so I feel like that's such a good one. And then obviously that kind of catapults the rest of the series. So, and that's, again, one of those ones that makes sense. It's, like you say, it's such a good one for the particular genre as well. Because, like you're saying, it is a little bit ridiculous and it's very outlandish, and it just works really well. I feel like you're saying, if it was a drama, it would have taken itself a lot more seriously. I feel like the fact that it doesn't definitely helps and plays into the, like the idea of the cliffhanger, even the way that it's revealed when like Ted Danson's character, who's, I can't even remember his name, which is terrible. Michael, yeah.
It's just like the most generic name ever.
So he's been like this super nice Is there not an angel called Michael as well? I don't know, we're getting into
Possibly.
Sunday school territory here.
Yeah, you're probably right, to be fair. That'll be the next podcast, religion.
Exactly. So the whole way through he's been like a literal angel basically, and he's been so nice, and he gets really upset when things don't work out, and there's that one moment when Eleanor says we're in the bad place, when he like switches like that, and he's such a good character throughout, and it just kind of adds another, because up to that point he was like super annoying, like, oh god, he's getting a bit much. So that's nice. It kind of like changes that one particular character as well, almost into like a villain, and then he kind of becomes like an anti-hero. Like it's that whole thing that wouldn't have been a thing had that conclusion not come about.
Yeah.
Another one I wanted to mention, and I'll be very vague about this because we spoke about this and it is about Lost, so I'll I think it's season 4, and I'll just describe it very vaguely, but basically there's a very specific premise for Lost, and this particular cliffhanger subverts that, and I feel like it does it so well because from the very first episode, Lost is weird and it subverts your expectations. You think it's just going to be a plane crash on a desert island, and then on the very first episode you realise that all is not as it seems. This isn't an ordinary desert island, and the kind of conclusion, if you will, of this particular cliffhanger, and we should watch this. I'm sure it'll take you years to watch Lost, but we should come back and have a discussion about it afterwards. But this particular conclusion does a really good job of almost like I don't want to say reigniting, I can't think of what the specific word is, but it just kind of breathes new life into the show, where it gets to a point where it could be feeling a little bit stagnant because they struggled through the writer's strike, and I think it was season 3, so they needed something to get them kind of back on it. And I feel like that was, I remember people talking about it at the time as well, which I feel like Lost, I feel like people spoke about Lost all the time. I don't know whether it was just because I was watching it at the time when it was coming out.
No, it was Lost was an event. Like, yeah, I think probably more than most. It's maybe the show that I can remember being on that I didn't really watch. Like, I think I watched, like, I remember my mum watched it for a bit, because I think the first 2 seasons were in Channel 4. And I think I saw like the odd episode with her, but it wasn't something that I watched, or I don't know if I wasn't allowed to watch it. I mean, I assume I was if I watched like the odd episode with her.
Yeah.
I don't really know what the situation was there and why I didn't really watch it, but I just remember being aware of like what the show was. I remember like seeing posters for it. And I do just, and it's weird, and that was like as a kid basically, and just like,
I think we must have been in about primary school, but I remember watching the pilot, which was weird. And then I remember they aired the final episode the same time here as they did in America.
Oh really? That would have been like a really big thing then as well, because that's still not even like done as like a normal thing, but like for a really long time, it was. You would have like ridiculous waits, wouldn't you? Yeah.
So that was me and my mum didn't watch it at the time, obviously, because I was still in school and she had no intention of staying up till 2 a.m. to watch it. So I think she had recorded it, but I'm sure I was weirdly enough at Alton Towers the following day, so she had to wait until I came back up. And during that time when I was there, obviously you were in service stations and that on the way down and back up, and I was like this, making sure I didn't look at any magazines or newspapers or anything like that. So I feel like even that kind of the last episode, because up until the last episode I feel like it kept you guessing. So yeah, I've managed to derail this into another Lost.
Yeah. No, but it is a very interesting point, because I do, like you say, it's just interesting, like the impact. Like Lost is probably like will always be seen as one of those TV shows that did change TV. Like it had a huge impact on like on just the way TV evolved. But yeah, that is a podcast for another time. But it is just
Yeah.
interesting. It's interesting to know about a show without like it's the same with like if I hadn't watched Game of Thrones, I've got I know people that obviously never watched Game of Thrones, but everyone is like aware what Game of Thrones is and probably knows like even things like the Red Wedding, even if they don't know what that is, they probably heard the term. So.
Yeah, I feel like that's that's kind of like a whole other different podcast, but that's such an interesting point when something has such a huge conclusion to a cliffhanger that like people are speculating about it and waiting for it and like waiting up to watch it as it airs.
Yeah.
But yeah, sorry, I derailed that slightly.
No, so well, I guess like the Dallas one is like I've never seen Dallas, but like Who Shot JR is just like I know about that cliffhanger, and obviously we discussed the whole Simpsons thing last time as well, which connects to it. But that is just interesting that is like the legacy of that show is pretty much that cliffhanger. And was Dallas the one that had the person? It's all a dream. Is that Dallas?
Yeah, I think it was like but they waited like an entire season. I'm sure, realized it wasn't working, and yeah, like the whole thing was in a dream, and really he was just in the shower.
Yeah. So those are the two things. Okay, those are the two things that I know. Which is like one of them was like they completely nailed it, and then the other one was like the worst thing they could have done. So
yeah, that's exactly the thing that I'm talking about. Where I'm like, God, please don't do that. Have some have the courage of your convictions and stick with it.
That's a very good point actually. Is you like whatever you do with the cliffhanger, like you say, just stick with it. That's another one that sorry again, we're just like rolling back into the previous point now, but I have seen shows that like retcon themselves and either like ignore the cliffhanger, don't ever like pay it off, or like will show you. I think this is like a trick that they used to do back when like cliffhangers were first invented, and like what was it, those like movies that they would show, those like the ones that like Star Wars
like
and
in the cinema.
Yeah, the ones like Star Wars and Indiana Jones and stuff, where like the term comes from basically, and they would like I think because there's not a bit in Misery where they talk about it, where Annie Wilkes talks about how annoyed she is at it, about the fact that they used to
because that's what it is, because his book ended in the character of Misery, she had been like buried alive or something.
Yeah, and then Annie Wilkes has like a rant where she talks about, and we're now talking about a movie based on a book, so gone so far off topic here. She talks about what is it? They would show like a cliffhanger, like maybe like a car going towards the edge of the cliff or a car driving off the edge of the cliff, and then they would like the next serial would start with like the main character jumping out the car before it like flies off the cliff, and she has a big rant about how like that's them cheating because like you don't see that happen in the first one, and there are shows that still do that sort of thing where like they just like re-show you the cliffhanger, but then there'll be like a bit that they cut out, or that couldn't even have like it doesn't even like fit within what they showed you, but they were just like, yep, no, that definitely happened, that's how they survived.
And they're like, anyway, moving on.
yeah they always do that and then immediately run straight into the plot, and they're like, just don't think about it.
Exactly. But yeah, those were my kind of 2/3 examples that stuck out to me. What do you have any that stuck out straight away?
Yes. So yeah, I did one of the first ones that came to mind, which so obviously we talked about Sherlock. I think one of the best cliffhanger resolutions I've ever seen is at the start of the second series, where the first series ends, where they have that like standoff with the guns, Moriarty and the swimming pool and the bomb, and it just ends with everyone like pointing guns at each other, and it's all. I remember it's funny because like there was like speculation. I know that there was like speculation after that. As to like how they were going to get out of that situation. Like Sherlock had this gun. He's like, who was he going to shoot? Was he going to shoot the bomb? Was he what was going to happen? It's a very like tongue-in-cheek resolution where Moriarty just gets a phone call, and his ringtone is Staying Alive as well. And it's so good because it's just like the last thing. You just it never occurs to you that might happen. And I think again, it could so easily be a disappointing cliffhanger, but the phone call that he takes then launches the premise for that whole episode, and it's not even a Moriarty episode as well. And so it almost kind of sets up the entire season. which is only 3 episodes, so it's not that big of a setup. But it's just so interesting because it is a very clever way of very quickly dealing with like that problem. It sort of like pokes fun at itself and at the audience, and then like immediately is like, okay, you're now in the plot of the episode. And yeah, I just think it's like a very, very efficient and very like clever way to resolve a cliffhanger. So I always like that one. Another one, I think maybe one of the best cliffhanger one of the earliest cliffhanger resolutions that I remember being like, that was so clever. As another Stephen Moffat one, which given that we're discussing Inside Man as well, it makes sense to now if ever there's a time to praise him, it's going to be now. But I know that we've sort of discussed this before with the podcast, so sorry viewers. But I know that you haven't really seen Doctor Who, but I'm assuming that you still have an awareness of like Doctor Who things because again, it has been like a massive show. Especially when it first came back. So you aware of like the gas mask kid from like the Christopher Eccleston season? Have you ever like no? Okay, fair enough.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. It's just that's like the one thing that people I know that have never seen the show just seem to have like an awareness of that because that was like a big thing at the time.
I'm just so perpetually scarred by the weird dinosaur episode that's all I ever think about.
Doctor Who and dinosaurs don't go well together. They've tried I think a grand total of 2 times. Both times have been bad.
No. Dinosaurs are cool. Everyone loves dinosaurs as well. You'd think you couldn't go wrong with them, but
I think the problem is, and this will always be the problem, and it's because they tried to do it with a Matt Smith episode, and I remember as soon as they announced they did a dinosaur episode, my first thought was like, okay, but you're the BBC. You don't have the funds.
Yes, exactly.
Like, just don't do this. It's going to be bad, and it always is.
Yep.
Anyway, yeah. So basically, there's like Stephen Moffat. His like the first episodes he wrote for Doctor Who, were like a 2-parter set during the London Blitz, and they're basically terrorized by this kid who just wears a gas mask and just goes round and says, "Are you my mummy?" And if he touches you, you basically turn into like this gas mask creature like him. Your face morphs into a gas. It's really like chilling. Like I just genuinely remember. Yeah, it's really like effective. Gas masks are already really creepy. The London Blitz is like quite a grim setting. So yeah, I do remember watching it at the time and genuinely being like that. I was like, oh my god, okay, this show is scary. As like a 10-year-old kid. But the cliffhanger is basically the Doctor and his companions are in this like hospital, and there's all these like dead gas mask patients, and then they all come to life, and then they all get up, and then they all start walking towards the Doctor and his companions. They're backed against the wall, all of them saying, "Are you my mummy?" And then it's like the cliffhanger, and then the way that it's resolved is at the opening of the next episode, they're right in front of the Doctor's face, and he just goes, "Go to your room." And tells them off. He tells them off like a parent telling off a kid, and then it works. And then he just turns around and goes, "I'm so glad that works. That worked because those would have been terrible last words." And it's just, and then that's like the start of the episode, and it was just like genuinely remember seeing that, and I was like, that's one of those things that you would never in a million years think of, but makes so much sense. And again, it's only used that one time, so it's like it's perfectly done. Another one.
Actually, sorry, just quickly, and I would never have thought to use like, because when I'm thinking of resolutions, it's always like serious ones and ones that make sense for the plot. But I really love that kind of just like hilarious, like it's like almost it's like parallel to like the really lazy like just ignore that you jumped out at the last second, but they're like you said before, kind of like poking fun at it, but.
I think it's clever because it effectively it gets out of it by like shifting genres, by basically turning like a horror moment into a comedy moment, and it does it as well because they've set up the psychology of like this monster and then they use that against it. It's creepy because it's a kid and it's just like asking the same question over and over again, and you kind of like forget that it's a kid that you're dealing with, and then that is like such a clever way of being like, it is a kid and it does think like a kid, so you can use that against it. Yeah, that. Another one, and this is one that you have seen. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, you have seen it. You definitely have seen it because I like did a mental check on this. It's a Buffy the Vampire Slayer one. And it's, I think we joked about it at the time. It's when they introduced Kendra, the Vampire Slayer.
Yes. It's hard work.
Which but I like, as just like an idea, like, you know, there being another Vampire Slayer. I remember watching that and being like, okay, was not expecting that, because they do a really good job of like setting up this character as like a threat, and then the last thing you're expecting is for not only her to be an ally, but actually be like another Vampire Slayer, because obviously they make a big deal of it.
They kind of like lore is that there's only one at a time type thing.
Yep, and then the explanation behind it as well, which I genuinely remember thinking like, did I not like, how did this never occur? Is obviously in the first season of Buffy, in the finale, she dies, and they make a really big deal about the fact that she's going to die, and then she does die, and then she comes back to life. And then when Kendra's introduced, they're like, well, yeah, like the Slayer died, so there's a new Slayer. And again, it's just one of those things. It's like, that's so obvious. Like they literally tell you that over and over again, and then it's still used in such a way that it plays as such a surprise. So yeah, that was one that I really wanted to shout out. And the last one that I wanted to mention is, so did you ever watch Misfits?
No, actually, I didn't. I don't know. I couldn't tell you why I didn't watch it. I just never, because I remember it being on.
Yeah, Misfits was great. It feels like it was kind of like, retrospectively feels like it was very ahead of its time, with it being a sort of like British superhero show. But yeah, no, Misfits was great. More for like the teen drama aspect than like the superhero thing. But the season one. I mean, do you mind if I spoil Misfits for you? If you do mind, I won't.
By the way, I'm about 15 years too late, so I wouldn't.
Yeah, fair enough. In the first, basically the whole premise is like, you know, these young offenders get superpowers, and then there's a running joke with one of the characters, Nathan, that he just doesn't have, like, he just didn't get superpowers, and he's just really bitter about the fact because everyone else has all these powers, and he just literally has just like nothing going on. And in the season one finale, he ends up getting pulled off a roof with another character, and it's a really, you know, he was like the fan favorite character. They kill him off. They have a funeral and stuff, and it's really upsetting. It's really emotional. Episode basically ends, and then it's sort of like, I'm pretty sure the camera like pans down, and then it's his coffin, and he comes back to life, and that's his power, is that he's immortal. He's obviously
that's good.
being buried. And if you rewatch the first season, there are actually little hints that they drop about this as well, sort of like you were saying. The way that they get out of that, the way that they get out of him being alive and being buried alive, is one of the characters can read minds, and she goes to visit him and reads his mind, so works out that he's alive, which again is another like one of those things where it's just really cleverly done, because I do remember everyone talking at the time like, okay, great, he's alive. How the hell is he getting out of that?
No, that's fair. That is clever.
Yeah. So shout out to Misfits for that. So those are pretty much my examples for like cliffhangers that I feel like were satisfyingly resolved, or like resolved in an interesting way. Do you have any examples of the opposite? Do you have any examples of cliffhangers where like the resolution has just not done it for you?
Yes. One that almost immediately sprung to mind was, of course, Game of Thrones. And the Game of Thrones started off so well, and I feel like once it got to the point where it overtook the books, it got just pretty dreadful, I'll say. Which is weird, because I like, there's a lot of like fan theories out there where fans have thought things through, and George R. R. Martin's basically come back and said, pretty much, yeah, that's what's going to happen. Clearly the writers of the show were like, nah, we'll just disregard that. So the one in particular, or one of the ones in particular I wanted to talk about was, a spoiler again, the death of Jon Snow. So basically the episode, so at this point Jon is commander of the Night's Watch, and at the end of this episode, all the people in the Night's Watch go up and stab him, and he's getting stabbed multiple times. And at the end of the episode, he's lying in the snow, dying. And I feel like that was pretty shocking. But then
eyebrows were raised.
People were shocked. Because especially like John is such a he lasted the duration of the show. He's such like an important part of the show. He kind of represents like after all of his family are dead, he represents the kind of whole of the North. But basically the resolution to that cliffhanger, sorry, is that, oh, thank God we had Melisandre here, who's a kind of witch. So just bring her in and she'll revive him and he'll come back to life. And I feel like it just felt so lazy. Like, the stakes were high for one episode when we thought that John was dead, and then he's not, and there's no consequences for him being brought back to life. Like, maybe if there was some kind of weird, like, if there was some kind of I can't think of the word, like, part of him being brought back to life that was like bad or detrimental, like he couldn't, like maybe he had weird like zombie tendencies or something like that, do you know what I mean? But there was absolutely nothing. Like, he came back as he was, and it was very much like the writers needed him to not be in the Night's Watch anymore. But of course, John is so particular about, he took his oath. I mean, he picks and chooses which oaths he wants to follow. But it's almost like they're like, it wouldn't make sense for John to leave the Night's Watch, so what we'll do is we'll kill him off, then his watch is ended technically, and then when we bring him back to life, he can just carry on and go about his day. And it just was exactly that thing I was talking about, but it just felt so lazy and so... It's very similar to what you were talking about with Buffy, but the Buffy one, it was a bit more kind of on brand with the genre, with the show.
Yeah.
Whereas this one was very, very, very much felt to me anyway like, we kind of want the story to go this direction, but we can't really think of a way around it, so we'll just kill him and bring him back, and then it'll all be well.
I think you're right. I think like the biggest, I like the idea of him coming back, and I think there's a lot to that, especially at that point with the show, which, you know, had become so synonymous with like killing off main characters. Like, you know, it is quite clever to then be like, actually this time we're going to undo it. But like you say, I think that the big mistake there is there's not enough consequence that comes of it. It's kind of like it's kind of like only positive things that comes out of like him having been killed, which is just like, for a show that's as bleak as it is, you say there should have been. And it didn't even have to be, I think it wouldn't even have to have been like a cost to him. You wouldn't have had to have done it in such a way where it's like, okay, well now, you know, it's not the Jon Snow we remember, or they could have done it in a way that they brought him back, but maybe like in terms of balance, you know, they could have even tied it to the White Walkers in some way, and had like, you know, maybe like him coming back affected them, maybe like it tipped the scales so that they were suddenly stronger. They could have done it in a way that like there was another negative consequence that like was very much then felt, you know, it should have, bringing him back should have caused more problems than it solved.
Like bringing him back, they could have brought him back, but in order to do that, they would have to, someone else would have to have taken his place, kind of thing. And then that would have, it just felt to me like so lazy. Like, and I feel like the entire show from that point on very much went the same way.
I think
I'm not a fan of the later seasons.
No, I think they have their moments, and again, this is once again we're like, this is podcast within podcast, this episode. Yep. But yeah, I do think that one of the issues that the show had, like in the last few seasons in particular, was again, it it suddenly got really cheap in terms of like characters having plot armor, and like the whole like stakes of like anyone can die just kind of like evaporated those last couple of seasons. And I think it is probably quite fair to say that it kind of did start with the resurrection of Jon Snow, because even though it's not a trick they pull again, it still does, when you do something like that, you do have to be very, very careful that like the impact that has to like the world, And it wasn't handled amazingly.
Yeah, because like you're saying, there is no consequences. So every time someone else dies, you're like, just get Melisandre in the case.
Yeah.
Like,
Thank God we have this. Thank God we got her.
Exactly. Thank God she was in the wall at the time. Another one I wanted to just touch on very briefly was also Game of Thrones, also Jon Snow. And this is definitely to a lesser degree because I felt like the build up was a lot better for this one, and that's the Battle of the Bastards, when it appears that Jon's been, and he is, and getting like crushed by the kind of mob in the middle of the battle, and then that bit was so good. That was one of those moments where I was like, oh god, this is really tense. It felt super like visceral. I remember feeling uncomfortable when I was watching it, and then just at the last second, I can't even remember specifically who it is, but it's basically like the cavalry comes up over the hill to save them.
It's Littlefinger.
As a, of course. Ugh. Again, not my favourite character by any means. Yeah, it's just exactly that thing that I just don't like, where I'm like, oh, right, okay, so once again, Jon Snow, was he ever really in any danger? Like, it just, I don't know whether that's maybe come from the fact that by that point he had died and come back to life, so it's maybe like, oh, well, they didn't kill him before, why would they kill him now? And I remember that felt very like something out of like an old war movie. Do you know what I mean? Like,
it's very Lord of the Rings. End of, I mean, they do that a couple of times in Lord of the Rings, where like all hope's lost, and then surprise, there's an army that's appeared.
Yeah, like the armies. I'd love to think that the armies, like Littlefinger was like had a watcher over the hill. Like, is he really struggling just now? Is it a bit too early? It would be awkward if we did it now.
He does have a flair for the dramatic Littlefinger. Old Peter Baelish.
I can imagine he was saying, "Wait, like no." Everyone's like, "We'll go now," and he's like, "No, we'll wait until all hope is lost." So yeah, as we figured, those are not my cup of tea. With I don't know whether that's just maybe the particular movies that I'm used to watching or TV shows that just generally don't include that kind of like. For me, it always feels really cheesy, like, and often out of place.
Yeah, it's a very movie-ish, Hollywood-ish type thing, isn't it? When like it's the massive, again, very similar to Deus Ex Machina, where it's where something comes in and saves the day at the 11th hour, and it can work, it can be done well, but like it just does feel very movie-ish, I think, and a show like Game of Thrones that established this sort of gritty realism, and characters, that it kind of like defied those like tropes. So when it kind of leans on them and uses them, you are a bit like, oh, okay. I think that's very fair. I think those are good examples as well. Are there any others that you got out of curiosity?
That was all. I only had eyes for Game of Thrones for that particular one, apparently.
Fair enough. To be fair, and I know that there will be ones for other shows, but most of the ones that came to mind for me were all Doctor Who related. And yeah, because like a lot of the stuff that, I mean, to be fair, that show is like a slot for cliffhangers, so it's like it kind of is. It's like part of the show's DNA, and it's run for a very long time, so it's going to get it wrong a lot of the time, especially given that like it's not like Game of Thrones. It doesn't have like this huge cast of characters where it can kill them off every week. But it does like to pretend it will, so it can have problems. I think, some of the like bigger offenders that I wrote down were, in like one of the latest seasons, I think the season that was on last year, they have, in like, it was like a 5-part story, was just like the entire series, 6-part, and I think it's like the cliffhanger to like several episodes, but in particular I think they like raise the stakes of it every single time. So I think it's like at its biggest and worst point going into the finale, where like they basically say like most of the universe has been wiped out by like this big event, or this big like energy. I can't even remember what it was, to be honest. Basically, most of like the universe is just gone. Like it's just been obliterated. They just never come back to that. They
Oh
just
God.
never ever touch on that again. It's the weirdest thing. Like, they make a really big deal about how much of the universe is being like eroded throughout the season, and then I think like the cliffhangers like going into it is like, oh my god, like most of the universe is gone, and then at the end they just like they defeat the thing, whatever it is that's like been destroying it. They stop it, but they don't undo anything. Like, everything is still, most of the universe is still gone. It's just really weird that they just ignore it. And they kind of have a wee moment of like, yeah, the Doctor like saved the day, but like really didn't.
For who?
Yeah,
Like, saved the day for who?
mathematically he didn't. Like, you would, I'm pretty sure that still counts as genocide in terms of like the whole universe. Which I'd say that's a
pretty
loss.
dramatic, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that one was bad. There's another one in, I think it was the 5th season, and this one, okay, this one I'll come at Stephen Moffat for, because this is one of this is a weird one because it's like the end of one of the seasons, and there's like stuff that just hasn't been tied up, and they basically like re-establish that in the final scene of the last episode, where the Doctor's like, yeah, there's these things. They literally list like there's these things that we need to like not explain, but he's like, we need to understand, and it's like, it's kind of like almost like looking at the audience and being like, this is what the next season's going to be, us exploring these specific things, which the show had never done before. So I remember at the time being like, that's really cool. They've actually like, rather than tying everything up in this one episode, they're actually setting up stuff for like the next series, and then they're going to explore that, and it led to there being like a really cool sense of momentum going into the next series. Then they just don't explain a bunch of the stuff that they like actually say that they're going to explain, and made a really big deal out of in those like episodes as like being big questions, and it's really strange. Like,
That's so annoying. Things like that always really annoy me, because obviously when we did our uni course together, like, the lecturer was pretty strict about things like tying things up, or why would that happen, that doesn't make sense. I mean, we had to think about everything that we were doing, and I mean it was definitely helpful. It definitely made us, I would argue, like, better writers for things like that, because so I think that's why stuff like that annoys me even more, because I'm like, God, our lecturer would have had something to say about that.
no, exactly.
We handed that in.
I know, and I think it's frustrating with a show like Doctor Who, which, it's one of those things that is as like an IP, it is massive and has been massive for so long. It obviously has this like huge following, and so it's one of those things where, like, that there's going to be a lot of fans that are going to spend a lot of time picking this stuff apart, like, especially from like someone like Stephen Moffat, who was that exact Doctor Who fan with like the classic episodes, so he literally knows what that's like. And I'm pretty sure the classic Doctor Who episodes have like loads of issues like that themselves, where there's just like all these things that are just kind of never, which I guess is maybe why he kind of because at one point there's like the last thing he ever wrote for Doctor Who officially was a novelization of one of his episodes, and in that novelization he pokes fun at the fact that he just never explained this stuff, which was nice. I mean, it was for me, it was nice to see that he actually acknowledged it, because it just drove me insane for so long that not only is it just not explained, but it's just never. There's also not like, he's someone that gets this, obviously been interviewed a lot over the years about Doctor Who specifically, and it's always annoyed me that no one's been like, what happened there? What? Like, no one, all the times he's been asked questions, it's always the same questions he's asked at like conventions and stuff, and I'm like, can someone just ask this question? I just would like an answer. Any answer would do.
A fan would have asked that, like, at a
exactly,
convention or something. And maybe they were all warned. Maybe they did ask the question and then it was never recorded.
Yeah, he's like, this is the one thing I'll never answer, so no one asks. You get dragged into a model police box and beaten up if you ask this question.
Chucked out the other side.
Yeah, exactly. So now that that's hit my system, the other one that came to mind, and you could argue it doesn't really count. This one's it's another sci-fi example, and I kind of like it, kind of don't. And it's Red Dwarf, where like every season of Red Dwarf ends on like a kind of cliffhanger that they then like build the next season out of. And so if you don't know, Red Dwarf classically ran from like season 1 to season 8, and then was cancelled, and then was kind of revived a couple times by Dave, and is now still kind of going, I think.
I remember fairly recently there being like adverts about it kind of coming back.
They did a special in 2020, and they
Oh, was
said
it?
after that they were going to do more, but I don't think there's been any news on it for a while. So I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things where I don't think it gets tons of coverage. I think it just kind of like will release a special. I know that like because the cast are getting kind of old. I think that's why they're now like we're only going to do individual specials because like it's actually getting difficult for some of the actors to like be doing it, which is fair enough. But so you mentioned obviously Red Dwarf doing seasons 1 to 8, and then when Dave brought it back, it was like these like 3 connected episodes called Back to Earth, and then they actually brought it back properly as like a series again, and brought it back with series 10. But what they'd never had, so there is no Red Dwarf series 9, and there's a bunch of stuff that happens in season 8, season 7 into season 8, that when they come back has just kind of been like resolved or dealt with, and it's never explained. And the show does also poke fun at the fact that there is just like canonically a season missing, and kind of uses it, kind of like plays a joke on that fact. And they kind of like, I think the guy that like created or co-created and like runs Red Dwarf basically said he was like look, when we were bringing it back, we knew that we were bringing back this niche sci-fi series, and it was already going to be really difficult to like reintroduce that to like a modern audience who hadn't really seen the originals, and he was like really didn't want to just like start things off with trying to explain away these little things that most people aren't going to know about, most people aren't going to care about. He was like, Red Dwarf has been off the air for a long time. He was like, we figured the best thing to do was to just like acknowledge the fact, because I think they have a joke where they basically reference the season 9 as like the show's best season.
That's funny.
So they do just kind of like poke fun at the fact. It's like, oh yeah, there's this mysterious season that you're just never gonna get. So I kind of it's a novel way of like dealing with it, and it makes sense because the show was cancelled and so was off the air for a really long time. So I appreciate like the way they do that, but at the same time, like I feel like if I had watched Red Dwarf back when it first aired, and had wondered about these things for years, and then it had come back and done that, I could also imagine being really annoyed. So
yeah. And that would be infuriating, but you would watch the entire season 10 because you'd be like, surely they must be paying this off.
Yeah, what's the game here? What's the welcome?
Yeah.
But no, nothing. So yeah, those are my examples.
Very fair, yeah.
Sweet. So the last thing I kind of want to talk about with regard to cliffhangers was just a sort of small point, and that was to do with like the pre-credit, because like, you know, if you were to break down stories, if you break down episodes, you could argue that there's like many cliffhangers throughout episodes. But I think one of the more interesting ones is like, you know, shows, especially like longer running shows, or serialized shows, will often do like pre-credit cliffhangers. And yeah, I just wondered if you had any, you know, what were your thoughts on the pre-credit cliffhanger? Like, do you think it plays differently to like a normal cliffhanger? Do you think it should play differently? Do you think they're effective? Do you like them?
I feel like I would say that they definitely play differently, but I feel like it's I do like them. I like the idea of them. I feel like they play differently enough that it kind of it's like a good way to almost like get you into the episode, like maybe like the start of a new season. When you don't want to go like hard with like a really big cliffhanger that you missed last season, or that you kind of left off with. It's such like a nice way to just kind of get you back into it, and to get you, and the easiest way to explain it, to just get you to keep watching. I like I like the idea that it's like almost confirmed that it's going to be resolved within that small kind of episode.
Yeah.
And I feel like that would also be quite difficult to do, and to do it well, because a lot of the like the kind of joy, if you will, of like episodic cliffhangers is that there's a lot of build up. So I feel like the pre-credit cliffhanger, there's absolutely no build up, so you just get that tiny little short amount of space to create something, to create this kind of cliffhanger thing, and then boom, straight into the episode, and then you've kind of got that episode to resolve it. I feel like they should be used kind of like sporadically though.
Yeah.
Like I feel like it could get very old, and you probably could use it as like a kind of like a staple of your show, like the way the shows use narration, or do you know what I mean? That could be like your show's thing. But I feel like it would get very old very quickly. Do you know what I mean? It would feel a bit more like kind of, like those kind of like one episode shows where each episode is kind of like a different thing.
It's funny.
I just described a TV show. Each episode is a different thing.
Episode 16, everybody.
Yeah. We'll just stop here. You guys don't know anymore.
No, I was gonna say, funnily enough, you mentioning that because, like, obviously drawn on this one a lot this episode, but Doctor Who is another really like it's probably like maybe one of the most famous examples for it, to the point where like the theme tune almost kind of like plays on that, the way that it like starts out with like the credit sequence, because it is just like a thing that show uses all the time. But I think, and again, for me, looking at Doctor is a good way of like understanding what that pre-credit cliffhanger should do. And I think what it really should do is kind of the same as like what we're saying with like cliffhangers, where it should kind of set up the premise of the episode. Yeah. You know, it should, and you know, sometimes it will like an episode will start and you think it's going one way, and then like something will happen. There'll be a revelation. There'll be a moment, and it's a really interesting way of being like, you know, the show going like, okay, this is actually what the episode's going to be. So I think they can be quite fun that way.
I feel like sorry, just quickly to interrupt. I feel like Grey's Anatomy is a big one for that. Like they love a good episode that starts with the Doctor covered in blood in their scrubs walking down a hallway in slow motion. They've done that more times than I can count, and then it's Meredith's infamous voiceover talking about some kind of abstract concept like forgiveness or love.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? They not as much. It seems it's very much like you assume they've killed a patient or a patient has died in some horrible way. You watch the entire show and they did kill a patient or the patient died in some horrible way. But it's such like that kind of like if that show in particular kind of like feeds into like this kind of like gore aspect that I feel like people will love when they watch Grey's.
Yeah.
So it's almost like what you're gonna get. There's gonna be blood everywhere.
Yeah, I think you've seen Breaking Bad. You've not seen Breaking Bad, have you?
I've not seen all of it. No, I've seen a couple of seasons. I couldn't even tell you how far I got.
Funnily enough, you talking about Grey's there just reminded me that Breaking Bad is one that like uses it quite a lot.
The first episode, did they not? With it's like his trousers flying in the air.
Yeah, and then it's him speaking to the camera, isn't it? Where he basically, and I think it does that. To be fair, it doesn't overuse it, and I think it was one of the shows that was like was one of the earlier ones to kind of use it as an idea. But yeah, we'll have throughout the show we'll have like out of context scenes, and then it'll be a little flashback, and then like contextualize what you've just seen. And I think obviously Better Call Saul being a sort of continuation / spin-off of it kind of uses it as well, even like in its last season. But I think by the last season of Better Call Saul, they're doing it in like much more subtle and kind of like symbolic and more interesting ways, where they'll maybe just show you like one out of context sort of image that will just, you'll be a bit like, what am I looking at here, what does that mean, and your brain kind of goes off in different places and you don't really understand, and it doesn't, then the episode won't actually show you exactly this is what that was. It's more like, it's more set up a symbolic point that then kind of pays off, and when you but also it does make sense in terms of like being as vague as possible here.
No, that's fair. I appreciate it, because I want to watch Better Call Saul, so I feel like I need to finish Breaking Bad.
Yeah.
In order to do that, which.
It is worth doing, but like I do like Breaking Bad a lot, and I feel like if I rewatched it now, I would enjoy it a lot more. But I would say that like I have a lot more issues with there's just something about it that I just don't think I care that much about, like the cartel and drugs and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, like that's such a good point. Like I wouldn't choose to watch like a documentary about
No.
drug cartels or crystal meth or anything like that. I'm like,
Exactly. I feel like that feels like a very Americanized thing. Where I can see the appeal. I think it is a very American show, and Better Call Saul is as well. But I think the whole legal aspect of Better Call Saul just makes it like infinitely more interesting.
Yeah.
Than but yeah, I'm not going to turn this into a Breaking Bad podcast now.
I know. I was gonna start talking there, and I was like, nope, because we will just.
I know. We'll do it again. Yeah, I think the only example I wrote down here for like a pre-credit sort of cliffhanger that is a bit different that I quite liked. And again, you'll never guess who wrote this one. Yeah. It's my example's from it's the last season of Sherlock, and it's the episode The Lying Detective, and it starts off. I can't even remember exactly how it starts off, but I just remember. I think there's like a sort of crime scene-esque. There's danger. There's something going on, and a sports car like comes spinning round, and I can't even remember if there's a character in the boot of the car. I think there is a character in the boot of the car, and then the sports car door opens, and it's Mrs. Hudson that's been driving it, and then it just goes like straight into the credits. And obviously it does explain how the episode like has a lot of fun with explaining like what was going on there. But that I think was just like a very striking example of like it is so obviously constructed to get you to be like, what is going on here? And it is bonkers, but it is so effective because you are just like, well, I need to know.
Yeah, like that. Yeah, that's a very good example. I like as well. You're just using a lot of examples that are using humor to conclude them,
that's
which I do enjoy.
Very good point, actually. That's clearly a trick that works very well on me.
Fair enough. I do the absolute opposite when I'm like, if this doesn't make absolute sense and is really clever and well written, I don't want to hear about it.
Yeah, if this isn't ironclad,
exactly.
You'll see me on the forums. Anyway, so lastly, Inside Man. As we said, we'd get back to it. So now that the show's done, now that you've seen it all, what are your thoughts? Have your thoughts changed at all? Where do you sit with the show now?
So I feel like I did really enjoy it, and I did enjoy the second half. But I feel like I don't know whether it's just the way that we watched it or the way that we discussed it. But I feel like the first two episodes were stronger than the second two episodes. I don't know whether a lot of that was because the first two episodes were like, there's so much setup that you were like, how is he going to get out of this? Like, there was a lot of work for the cliffhanger. Like, what is going to happen here? We obviously had a lot of fun speculating last time what was going to happen, how it was going to happen. And I feel like, don't get me wrong, there was some bits in the second two episodes that were amazing. But I feel like it just didn't have the same kind of... It felt almost like... It felt like they were wrapping it up.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? But I did, in saying that, don't get me wrong, I did really enjoy it. I was a little bit kind of disappointed that like we spoke about last time, that I thought that there was going to be a lot more kind of crossover between the kind of American story and the British story, and I feel like that wasn't done particularly thoroughly, maybe.
Yep.
There was obviously the kind of crossover at the end, but I just feel like I wanted a little bit more from that storyline. I wanted it to... I feel like it didn't justify it didn't justify its own existence.
Yeah.
For me, anyway, I feel like that could have been done with someone in a British prison. Do you know what I mean? It could have been set. It could all have been set in Britain. There was nothing other than Stanley Tucci's performance that kind of merited it being set over there. Do you know what I mean? So I was a little bit disappointed by that. However, like I said, there were some amazing moments in those second two episodes. Again, super spoilers, but obviously the point with his wife when she gets hit by a bus or a lorry or whatever it is, that was like, I don't know, it was one of those moments where the split second before it happened, you knew it was happening because you saw her back into the road, and we've all seen it happen.
It has that like same framing, doesn't it? You just know that like the way the camera's tracking her and stuff, you're like, oh no.
Yeah, like get out of the road, hen.
Yeah.
But I feel like that in particular was like so like it made me feel really like ill, and it's not because I'm particularly squeamish or anything. I just feel like the way that it was done. And I feel like because it was his wife, I mean, and she's been like an accomplice, if you will, so she's not blameless. But I suppose the whole fun of the story is that no one is blameless, but no one is at fault 100% either.
Yeah.
I feel like it kind of came out of the blue because you were focusing on David Tennant's character, the son, the maths tutor.
The math tutor.
The maths tutor. I almost wrote in my notes several times, the piano teacher.
I do like that. I did find it really funny that they actually have like a justification for her psychology and connecting it to her being a maths teacher or a maths tutor. I felt like especially in like in the aftermath of our conversation, it felt like that was the show. It was like the show had been listening and was like, okay, we're gonna go out of our way to like explain why she's a maths teacher. Yeah.
But yeah, I feel like that again another great moment was when this is the thing where I feel like it used kind of like already established tricks like Silence of the Lambs is a very good example where you think that the police are going to the home of Buffalo Bill, but at the same time we're seeing Clarice and she's going to this old woman's house, and there's a knock on the door. The policeman knocks on the door. Buffalo Bill answers, but you see that it's actually been Clarice that has knocked on that door. They kind of do that, but in the flat. So, the journalist is in the bathroom and she says, "Oh, I think that's Morag. I think her name was." Like, let's pick a Scottish name for the Scottish actress.
That was. Can we have a sidebar to discuss that character, by the way? Because like,
yeah.
The weird thing about that character is like, so Stephen Moffat is Scottish. He's from Paisley, and
wow.
The actress.
Like, is he the most Scottish person you could find?
The actress is also Scottish, but it felt like he went into that character thinking, I am going to write the most like overtly Scottish character that you've ever fucking seen on screen, and then it felt like they hired her and they went, no, we don't want you to do your accent. We want you to do a Scottish accent. We want you to double down on the accent. And
I'm surprised she wasn't chugging cans and brew and eating tea cakes.
It was the bit that really got me, that like offended me was when was it the journalist referred to her as like an English police officer, and I was like, there is not a chance in hell you're making that mistake with her. There's no way the word English slips out your mouth when you're in the car with that woman.
I'm impressed that English journalist even knew what she was saying. I was struggling at points.
I know, it was wild. It was just, honestly, it was like she was doing an impersonation of a Scottish character. And it was like the character was written to impersonate Scottish characters. But again, it was played by a Scottish actress and written by a Scottish writer. It was so bizarre.
It was. And and the cherry on top was the fact that her name was Morag. And I don't remember hearing her surname, but I'm sure it was probably something like McTaggart.
Yeah, McLaughlin. Morag McLaughlin.
That's it. I can't even remember what I was saying. Oh no, that kind of bit where you think it's Morag McLaughlin coming in the door. But really it's the vicar's wife, and that was such a nice moment where the two kind of different worlds came together.
I think that was one of my favourite moments in it as well, with the way that it's played, where it's Stanley Tucci calling it's Beth the journalist, calling her bluff of like being I think it is Beth is her name. I know it's Lydia West.
It's terrible. I refer to everyone. I've got the journalist, the vicar, the piano teacher / maths tutor.
I think it's because I know the actors, like to the point where like I know the actors' names, so it's now really hard for me to like associate their character names with them. Like David Tennant's called Harry, is that right? The vicar.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And he always refers to himself as the bloody vicar. So.
Yeah, he does have that line like 4 times. But yeah, no, it's the fact that obviously she's constantly said to Stanley Tucci that she's really good friends with with Dolly Wells, with the maths teacher. Janice, yes, that's her name. Thank you. And yeah, it's such a good way of him calling her bluff, being like, oh, like, you know, you should recognize your friend's flats. And then that reveal that like that's where she that was really nicely played, I thought.
That was very well done.
The confrontation as well with the wife and Beth, where she's like threatening with a knife and then like in a panic cuts her and then is immediately like apologizing.
I love that as well. Like, have you ever been caught out in a lie that's been so ridiculous? Like when the journalist is like, that wasn't there before, and she's like, oh, it must have been. Oh, anyway, I'll need to go now anyway.
And then
it was that kind of lovely British humour.
Yeah, and then she starts laughing at one point as well, when like just at the ridiculousness of it, and I was like, it was really, really well played, I think.
Yeah, 100%. But yeah, I feel like I was saying, the final kind of part, I wasn't massively keen on, like with when Janice is visiting Stanley Tucci's character because her husband went missing.
Yeah.
Or it's something like she says it's to solve her husband's murder, and he's like, oh, but your husband's not dead. I feel like that was just, I don't know, I didn't like that point. I feel like it could have ended 5 minutes earlier. But I don't know whether that is maybe because Janice isn't the most likeable character.
I was rooting for her to get killed by a carbon monoxide.
Exactly. I was like, turn that thing up, boy.
It's a slow death.
Ben.
It is Ben, yeah. Again, I just know him as Louis.
Yeah. What were your thoughts? Did you enjoy it? Did you think it was better or worse?
So yeah, my thoughts on the last two episodes. I think I like generally agree with what you're saying. I think the thing that kind of annoyed me, and you were kind of saying this with like your comments in the very end of the show, is like I thought it was going to be more of like a closed thing. It felt like it was setting up like another season. It very much was setting up another season, and it would have just I was kind of hoping for just this like resolved story. This just like one-off single, especially with it only being like 4 episodes. I just kind of thought it was just going to be like a single story told. And yeah, I would have liked to have seen it all wrapped up and sort of paid off. And like you say, I think the questions it threw out were more interesting than some of the answers that we got. But I think that was all.
I did like the kind of continual battle up to the very last second that David Tennant's character was having. Like, he didn't want to kill her, and then he decided he would with the heater with carbon monoxide poisoning, and then he didn't. He started to take the tape down, and then he started to put it back up, and then of course Ben, poor Ben, and ended up essentially just bashing her over the head with a hammer. And Harry again was prepared in order to kind of save his son to just like finish the job, and then she stirred and it made it a lot harder. Like, I feel like it did keep that kind of that thread that he was desperately trying to do the right thing to help his son, but at the same time I feel like it's not even just that he's a vicar. I feel like normal people don't have any desire to kill people. Do you know what I mean? We would avoid that at all costs. So that watching like his kind of internal struggle did carry out throughout, which I did appreciate. But I do apologise. I just hijacked your whole point there.
No. I completely agree with what you're saying. Like, I think we said that last time, that is the more interesting part of the show, was that that sort of moral I guess vice that he's in, and they do a good job of picking like someone who I like the fact that he's a vicar, but they play it so straight in terms of like he actually does believe in God and he actually does believe in being a good person. And it's just not something you really see nowadays. It's like a vicar that's genuinely like, and
because he even makes that joke in the program where he's like, well, people will believe it easy enough, like that's what they want to believe.
Exactly. They refer to the fact that like the reputation of the church is besmirched. But it was quite nice to see like the sentimentality there, and again I think they do a good job of like they do kind of punish the characters, but without it feeling like a bit forced. Again, the wife getting killed and obviously him ending up being in prison. And again, they do make it clear, like you say, like he was gonna kill her. And like there's that final hesitation. I think as well that was a clever way to sort of like keep the story turning. Was obviously not just bringing Ben into like the situation, but actually having him in the basement and then trapped. And at one point, I didn't think they would go that far, but I was like, I like the tease of like the idea that maybe he just does kill Dolly Wells and his son, and then that is kind of like the cruel and ironic payoff. And I think again, I think a different show would have done that. If you didn't have the whole Stanley Tucci thing, then they could have done that. But yeah, I do agree that like the Stanley Tucci thing, the David Tennant thing felt like its own contained story, and then the Stanley Tucci thing kind of felt like join us next season for like more of this.
Like it had been done before, like shows like those kind of formulaic shows like The Mentalist and Lie to Me and stuff like that, where it's like, oh, this not controversial, but like this weird person or this person who's got a weird job or is a serial killer helps solve crimes.
I see. I mean, it's very Sherlock as well. Like it's kind of a reskinning of that show with Stanley Tucci, and even like again the human lie detector guy. That was never paid off. That was a really weird thing to just like have in there. And just it never actually gets used for anything other than like it's just like a character trait, which I thought was just so bizarre because it's such a weirdly specific thing that you never see used, to just not actually do anything with.
Yeah, I feel like the whole kind of like American Stanley Tucci thing felt not as thought out as the kind of David Tennant storyline, which was weird. And I am still a little bit disappointed that they didn't tie it together slightly better. Yeah,
I agree. It would have been nice to get like a more, like you say, it could have just been a British prison, and it kind of felt like it was done that way just so that you were asking questions and you were wondering about that, but then didn't actually wasn't as meaningful as it could have and should have been.
I did like that kind of final shot where it would appeared that David Tennant and Stanley Tucci were talking to each other like in the same room. That was a cool shot.
Yeah.
But I'm like, would they allow him to chat to him via webcam? Do you know what I mean? That's like that horrible logical part of my brain where I'm like, they probably wouldn't have allowed that. And I feel like the show, the British part of the show anyway, up until that point was kind of believable. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Far-fetched, but it's still believable.
Yeah, it's one of those like, again, almost sitcom-esque where it's the situation just like snowballs into like the worst version of itself.
Yeah.
Like it's
I
just
can't
kind
think of a show I have seen in a long while that things got out of hand quite like they did on that show.
Well, it really is. That to me just feels like the darkest possible version of like a sitcom.
Yeah.
And I know again Stephen Moffat like kind of like his background was in writing sitcoms, so it does kind of like play into his whole wheelhouse. And I think I think it would have been more interesting to just have that as be the show, and kind of strip away the Stanley Tucci stuff.
Yeah. Which is a shame because everyone likes Stanley Tucci. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, exactly. And I was very much looking forward. He was actually the thing that I was the most excited for. Like again, knowing nothing about the show, but going in, I was like, okay, well, I've not seen Stephen Moffat work with like all those other actors, but I've never seen him work with Stanley Tucci before, and I really like Stanley Tucci. So, but yeah, I mean, I think part of it, to be fair, was like, because I've watched interviews and stuff with like cast and crew since having watched the show, and they talked about the fact that basically the only reason Stanley Tucci was in it is because they filmed it during lockdown or like lockdown-ish, and he was just like, I think he was in Britain, he wasn't like leaving his house, he wasn't leaving the country, or he was leaving his house but he wasn't leaving the country, he was basically like staying rooted, and they just obviously built that set, which is literally next door to the house, because apparently the house was a set they built as well.
Oh yeah?
The director Paul McGuigan was saying that like, in paper it's like the simplest show because there's only like a handful of like locations, but he was like, but actually that they constructed like two of the biggest sets he's ever worked with like the house and the prison, which are like back to back. I think there's a bar in between.
That's funny,
as well.
yeah, because you could see the prison being a set because they had those kind of shots where it was obviously the two cells next to each other, but I didn't know the house was a set. I know,
yeah. I know. I
That
was very
stresses me out even just think about that. God, I'd
yeah,
rather
totally.
just find like a wee Airbnb somewhere.
I know exactly like the cost, but I
Mm,
guess like they get their money's worth because they do shoot like crazy in that thing.
that's true.
Um, but yeah, no. So Stanley Tucci stuff I think was filmed all like very very like close together. He kind of just like came in and did all the stuff in like the one location and then just
Mm,
left. So that was kind of how they got him. But yeah, it would have been again. You don't even necessarily have to take the character out, but like you say, it just would have been nice for it to have been more relevant.
yeah.
That's what he was doing. Do you think? Would you watch a second season? Would you want to see how Dolly Wells is going to kill her husband?
No. I think I would start it out of interest.
Yeah,
But I feel like while she was in the basement, she was such an interesting character. But I really have no interest in her out with.
yeah.
That sounds terrible, but do you know what I mean?
No, I very much agree that she was like the perfect character to be put in that situation because
Mm-hmm.
like her almost like ruthless logic and the way that she was kind of thinking about like deconstructing everything was so
Mm-hmm.
fascinating to watch because it was just like a dynamic you've not really seen before in the way that she
Yeah.
was kind of like the power play was really nicely done where like every time it felt like she was getting ahead it would like flip it, but then every time it felt like she was like falling behind it'd flip it again, and
Mm-hmm.
it was a really well considered like power struggle with
Yeah.
someone who should have just been powerless the whole time. So yeah, it felt like, you know, again, someone trapped in the basement and like people deciding what to do with them is something that you have seen on like shows and films loads of times before, but it felt like an original way of doing that. So
Yeah.
yeah, but I do agree that like I'm not. I mean, I would be interested. I would watch the second season, but I feel like the way that that's set up at the end is like we're talking about with cliffhangers is done in such a way that it's obviously not going to be as straightforward as they're making it seem. Like, because they don't mention her husband the whole show basically, and then at the very
Yeah.
end she mentions it and says how she wants to kill him. And again, I don't, okay, she's been through some stuff, but I also don't believe that she's just like a cold-blooded killer. So there's got to be like a twist there. So I mean, I've
Her
seen.
flat was suspiciously tiny.
Was suspiciously small.
Serial killer vibes.
I did see an interesting theory that, what was it? She is. I think she is either the wife or the twin sister of Stanley Tucci's, or the wife of Stanley Tucci's character. And when she says she wants help killing her husband, that's her husband, Stanley Tucci's character, or you think that's her husband anyway. That's who she's referring to because obviously
Okay.
his death is imminent, and there's the whole thing about the wife's head, and why that's not paid off, why you can't reveal the location of it. That's the speculation. There is that there's a connection to Dolly Wells' character and him, and that that's like the way that those things connect, which I'd be is an interesting theory. I don't know if there's any basis in it, but I think that's like, I definitely feel like there's definitely more to it, and I think I would watch it out of curiosity of that. But I think the second season would have to re-justify its existence more than like a lot of second seasons usually do.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like it could be done, but I feel like it would struggle slightly, obviously, because we both said that the David Tennant's part of it was the more interesting part.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think I wouldn't really want them to bring David Tennant's character back either. Like
No.
that it would just feel really contrived.
Yeah, like that's his story's done. Like
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, no, fair. I think on that note, on the note of his story being done, that's probably a good place to wrap this up. So thank you very much for your the 2-part discussion on cliffhangers and conclusions.
yeah, no worries. Thank you. It's super interesting, and I'm glad you picked Inside Man because I genuinely hadn't heard of it until you'd brought it up and you sent me a picture of it, and I was like, all right, okay, David Tennant dresses a vicar. Let's go for it.
Yeah, I'm quite happy with choosing it as well, actually, and I think it being just like 4 episodes made it quite interesting because like I feel like we got a lot more discussion out of it than we would have if we'd done it any other way. And it was it's interesting examining a show from the middle of the show and then re-examining it at its end. So yeah, thank you very much.
No worries.
And next time we're finally, after me like hosting this thing for 2 months straight, next month is finally going to be yours again. Like pried it in my hands. So I think I probably did say 2 podcasts ago, join us next time for Kathryn's. This time I mean it.
I know. Until 2 weeks from now.
Yeah. Exactly. But yeah, no, I very much look forward to seeing what you cooked up. And yeah, I'll hopefully get to do a bit less talking. So until then,
no, thank you again, Sam.
thank you, and thank you to anyone who watched.
See ya.
Farewell.